Hello there, and welcome to the Bedtime Science channel. Tonight, we're going to talk about dopamine, that quiet molecule inside your brain that shapes so much of what you do, what you want, and what keeps you going. It's behind your motivation, your cravings, your sense of satisfaction, and also the things that sometimes pull you off course. Most of what you've heard about dopamine probably isn't quite right. You've probably come across the idea of dopamine hits, little rewards your brain hands out. But the real story is more interesting than that, and a lot more gentle than you might expect. So tonight, we're going to settle in and slowly walk through what dopamine actually is, and what it isn't. How it moves through your brain and body, in slow, steady rhythms and fast, precise bursts, and why that difference matters more than you might expect. We'll explore how modern life, with its endless scrolling, instant rewards, and constant stimulation, quietly reshapes your dopamine system. Why everything can start to feel flat. Why motivation fades even when nothing is wrong. We'll look at how the brain balances pleasure and pain, how it learns from surprise, not just reward, and how habits form in ways that can help you or hold you back. And toward the end, we'll talk about simple, gentle tools, cold exposure, morning light, movement, rest, that can help restore your baseline. Not by chasing highs, but by letting the system settle. By the time this video ends, you'll understand yourself a little more deeply. What drives you? What drains you? And how to work with your own brain, rather than against it. But before we go deeper, let me share one quiet, fascinating finding with you. Something that shows just how powerful dopamine can be. Not through any substance, not through anything extreme, but simply through the things we choose to do. Just through behavior alone, your brain is capable of producing long, sustained rises in dopamine that can genuinely change how you feel and how you move through life. So get comfortable. Let the day fall away. And let's begin. There's a study worth knowing about. It was published in the European Journal of Physiology, and it tells us something quietly remarkable about what the body can do on its own. Researchers asked people to sit in water. Some of them sat in warm water, some in moderately cool water, and some in cold water, cold enough to feel it. They stayed there for up to an hour, with the water reaching just below their neck, their head resting above the surface. Throughout the experiment, the researchers drew blood. They were looking for certain chemicals, cortisol, norepinephrine, and dopamine. What they found with cold water was striking. Norepinephrine and epinephrine, you might know epinephrine as adrenaline, rose quickly. That part wasn't surprising. But dopamine rose too, and it kept rising. Around 10 to 15 minutes in, the increase became significant. And it didn't stop there. It climbed, and climbed, until it reached 250% above where it started. But here's the part that makes this finding so interesting. When the subjects got out of the water, the dopamine stayed high. It didn't crash. It lingered. A long, sustained lift, not from any substance, not from anything artificial, just from cold water and time. Many people today are curious about cold exposure. Some use it for metabolism. Some for mental clarity. Some simply because it makes them feel more awake, more steady, more themselves. There's a particular state of mind that cold seems to unlock, one where you feel alert, but also calm. Not jittery, not scattered, just present, clear. That state is useful for almost everything. Work, focus, connecting with others. Everything except sleep, perhaps. Later, we'll return to this study and look more closely at the details. How long, how cold, and how to do it in a way that limits the stress hormone cortisol. We'll also touch on certain compounds that may gently support dopamine levels, for those who are curious. But for now, just know that your body already holds the ability to shift how you feel. Sometimes all it takes is a change in temperature and a little patience. Let's talk about what dopamine actually does inside you. You've probably heard dopamine called the feel-good chemical. And while that's not entirely wrong, it's only a small part of the story. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, a tiny chemical messenger made deep inside your brain, in places with names like the substantia nigra, the ventral tegmental area, and the hypothalamus. But dopamine doesn't just make you feel good. It does far more than that. It helps you move. It shapes your motivation. It plays a role in learning, in memory, in attention, in mood. It whispers to your brain whether something is worth pursuing, whether a goal deserves your effort. When dopamine systems go wrong, the consequences can be profound. Parkinson's disease, addiction, depression, attention disorders. Dopamine sits quietly at the center of so much. And here's something interesting. Dopamine doesn't work in just one way. It has two modes, two rhythms you might say. The first is slow and steady. Scientists call it tonic dopamine. It hums along in the background at a low, constant frequency, like a soft baseline tone that keeps your system calibrated. This slow dopamine works through receptors called D2 receptors, which tend to calm things down, to inhibit. The second mode is fast, phasic dopamine. It fires in quick, high-frequency bursts, sometimes 20 times per second or more. These bursts are precise. They carry information. They tell your brain when something unexpected has happened, when a reward arrives, when something new and important demands attention. This fast dopamine works through different receptors, D1 receptors, which tend to excite to activate. So dopamine has a slow voice and a fast voice, and they do different things. A study from Harvard Medical School, published in 2024, helped clarify this beautifully. Researchers found that movement, the simple ability to walk, to coordinate your body, depends mostly on slow dopamine. Mice who couldn't produce fast dopamine bursts could still move around just fine. Their coordination held. This helps explain why a medication called L-Dopa, which raises dopamine slowly over time, can help people with Parkinson's disease regain movement. The slow signal is enough. But motivation, that's a different story. The same study showed that wanting things, the drive to pursue rewards, to put in effort, depends on fast dopamine. Mice without those quick bursts understood that rewards existed. They learned the rules. But they didn't care as much. They weren't as eager. The spark was missing. This may be why L-Dopa, for all its help with movement, often doesn't restore the motivation or mental sharpness that Parkinson's patients lose. The slow signal helps the body. But the mind needs the fast signal too. And then there's addiction. A study from the National Institutes of Health in 2023 looked at humans and found something striking. It's not just how much dopamine rises that matters, it's how fast it rises. Researchers gave people methylphenidate, the same compound found in medications like Ritalin, in two different ways. One group received it through N4, which reaches the brain quickly. Another group took it as a pill, which arrives slowly. Both methods raised dopamine by the same amount. But only the fast delivery, the 4, produced a feeling of being high. When dopamine rises slowly, it mostly activates those calming D2 receptors. The brain settles. But when dopamine rises quickly, it also lights up the D1 receptors, and with them, a network deep in the brain called the salience network, areas like the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the insula. This network is tied to the conscious experience of reward, the feeling of something mattering intensely. This is why the way a substance enters your body changes everything. Smoking or injecting a drug delivers it fast, and fast means a stronger, more gripping reward signal. A pill, taken slowly, may raise the same chemical, but without that rush. There are lessons here. For medicine. For understanding ourselves. For Parkinson's disease, it suggests we need new treatments, ones that can restore not just the slow rhythm of dopamine, but the fast one too. For addiction, it points to specific brain circuits that researchers are now exploring as targets for healing. And for medications like Ritalin, it reminds us that how something is taken, not just what is taken, shapes whether it helps or harms. Dopamine is not a simple switch. It's more like a language, with slow sentences and fast exclamations, each carrying different meaning. Now, let's slow down for a moment. Let's step back from dopamine itself, and look at the world we live in around it. Because we live in a time of overabundance. Food is everywhere. Entertainment never ends. Notifications arrive constantly. Music, videos, messages, news, images, all of it available in an instant. At any moment, day or night, you can reach for something that gives your brain a small reward. And every one of those small rewards nudges your dopamine. Not because dopamine is pleasure, exactly. It's more like a signal. A quiet voice in your brain that says, "This matters. Pay attention. Seek this again." Long ago, dopamine rose for things that helped us survive. Finding food after a long search. Learning something new. Forming a bond with another person. Exploring unfamiliar places. Those things took effort. They took time. They took patience. But today, many of the things that trigger dopamine require almost nothing at all. You don't need to hunt. You don't need to build. You don't need to wait. You just scroll, tap, swipe, and each time, dopamine rises a little. At first, this feels fine, pleasant, even. But over time, something quietly shifts. When dopamine is triggered too often, for too little effort, the brain begins to adjust. It turns down its own sensitivity. Scientists call this downregulation. It's not a malfunction, it's the brain trying to stay balanced, trying to protect itself from being overwhelmed. Think of it like this. Imagine a room where loud music plays all the time, day after day. Eventually, you stop noticing it. The sound didn't get quieter. Your ears just stopped responding as strongly. The same thing can happen with dopamine. When everything is stimulating, nothing feels truly motivating anymore. People sometimes describe this as feeling flat. Feeling restless, but also bored. Losing interest in things that used to bring joy. Wanting something but not knowing what. This isn't laziness. It isn't a lack of willpower. It's a nervous system that has been gently overstimulated for a very long time. In an environment of constant small rewards, the brain stops responding deeply to any single one. And so ordinary things begin to feel dull. A walk outside feels boring. A book feels too slow. A conversation feels like effort. Not because those things lost their value, but because the dopamine system has learned to expect faster, brighter, more. And here's something else worth understanding. Dopamine doesn't only rise when you receive a reward. It rises in anticipation of one. That means constant scrolling, constant checking, constant novelty, trains the brain to stay in a state of seeking, always reaching, always looking for the next thing, never quite arriving. This can quietly increase anxiety, because a brain that is always seeking is rarely at rest. Overabundance teaches the mind that the next moment is always better than this one. The next video, the next notification, the next idea. And so the present moment, this moment right here, starts to feel less interesting, less rewarding, less enough. This is why a life full of easy rewards can still feel exhausting. The nervous system never truly settles. But here is the gentle truth. The dopamine system is adaptable. Just as it can turn down its sensitivity, it can also restore it. Not through force, not through punishment or pressure, but through something simpler. Slowing down, reducing the constant hum of stimulation. Letting effort return, letting space return, letting quiet return. When stimulation softens, dopamine doesn't vanish. It becomes more meaningful. Small things start to register again. Stillness becomes soothing instead of uncomfortable. Effort becomes satisfying instead of draining. Motivation returns, not as a rush, but as a steady, quiet pull toward things that matter. This is how the brain was meant to work. Not in scarcity, not in excess, but in rhythm. So now that we understand how the world around us shapes dopamine, let's go a little deeper. Let's look at how dopamine actually moves inside you. How it rises, how it falls, and why that rhythm matters more than most people realize. Dopamine doesn't stay at one level all the time. It fluctuates. It breathes, in a way. There's a baseline, a quiet, steady hum of dopamine that circulates through your brain all day and all night. Scientists call this tonic dopamine. It's always there, like a soft background tone. Not exciting. Not dramatic, just present. This baseline is what allows you to feel okay, functional, capable of moving through life without everything feeling impossibly hard. But then, sometimes, dopamine spikes. Something happens. You eat something delicious, you accomplish something meaningful, you experience something pleasurable, and dopamine surges above that baseline. A sharp, fast rise. Scientists call this phasic dopamine. These are the peaks, the moments when the brain says, yes, this matters. Remember this. Now here's something important. Something that explains a great deal about how we feel over time. The peaks and the baseline are connected. They are not separate systems. When dopamine spikes high above baseline, it doesn't just return to normal afterward. It dips. It falls below where it started. A trough follows every peak. Think of it like a wave. The higher the crest, the deeper the drop on the other side. This is the quiet mechanism behind tolerance, behind craving, behind the feeling of needing more and more just to feel the same. When something causes a big dopamine spike, the trough that follows can leave you feeling lower than before you started. And if you reach for another spike to escape that trough, the cycle deepens. This is not a flaw in your brain. It's simply how the system maintains balance. But understanding it can change how you move through life. Now, let's look at some numbers, just to get a sense of scale. If your baseline dopamine is set at 1, then eating a piece of chocolate might raise it to about 1.5 times that level. A pleasant, gentle rise. Sex, for most people, raises dopamine to about twice the baseline. Nicotine, around 2.5 times. Cocaine, also around 2.5 times. Amphetamines, the spike can reach as high as 10 times baseline. And exercise. If it's something you enjoy, it can raise dopamine to about twice baseline as well. Similar to sex, but earned through effort. And that distinction, as we'll explore later, matters. But here's something else to hold gently in your mind. Dopamine doesn't only rise when you receive a reward. It rises before, in anticipation. When you expect something good is coming, dopamine begins to climb. This is what creates motivation, movement, pursuit, the wanting that pulls you toward a goal. This is why anticipation can sometimes feel even more alive than the reward itself. And it's also why constant anticipation, always waiting for the next thing, can quietly exhaust your system. One more thing before we rest this idea for now. Dopamine works through something called G-protein-coupled receptors. You don't need to remember that name. But what it means is this: dopamine's effects are not instant and shallow. They are slow and deep. When dopamine binds to these receptors, it doesn't just create a quick sensation. It reaches into the machinery of your cells. It can influence gene expression, the instructions your body reads to build and maintain itself. This is why dopamine isn't just about momentary pleasure. It shapes you. Over time, the patterns of dopamine you experience quietly sculpt how your brain responds to the world. And that's worth sitting with for a moment. Because it means the choices you make, what you pursue, how you pursue it, how often you spike and how often you rest, are slowly writing themselves into you. Not permanently. The brain can always adapt, but meaningfully, in ways that matter. So let that settle. And when you're ready, we'll continue. Now we arrive at something quietly profound. One of the most important discoveries in all of neuroscience. This is where dopamine stops being mysterious and starts to look like something almost elegant, like an algorithm running deep inside you. In the 1990s, a neuroscientist named Wolfram Schultz conducted a series of experiments with monkeys. The setup was beautifully simple. A monkey sat in stillness. A small door opened. Behind the door, there was food. At first, something interesting happened. When the door opened and revealed the food, dopamine neurons fired strongly. A clear spike. But not when the monkey reached for the food. Not when it ate the food. The spike happened at the moment of surprise. The moment of discovery. The brain was saying, "This is better than I expected." The experiment continued. Day after day. And something shifted. As the monkey learned the pattern, door opens, food appears, the dopamine response began to fade. Eventually, when the food appeared, there was no spike at all. The reward was still there. The food was still delicious. But it was no longer surprising. Dopamine had already done its job. And here's where it becomes even more interesting. If the door opened and the food was missing, dopamine didn't just stay flat. It dropped below baseline, a dip, a signal of disappointment. This experiment revealed something essential. Dopamine does not measure pleasure. It measures prediction error. Let that sink in for a moment. Your brain is constantly, quietly asking two questions. How much reward did I expect? And how much reward did I actually receive? The difference between those two answers is the prediction error. When the outcome is better than expected, dopamine rises. A positive prediction error. The brain takes note. It says, pay attention, learn this, try this again. When the outcome matches what was expected, dopamine stays steady. No spike, no dip, nothing new to learn. And when the outcome is worse than expected, dopamine falls below baseline. A negative prediction error. A gentle signal that says, something went wrong. Adjust. This is how learning happens. Not through pleasure, exactly, but through surprise and correction. What makes this discovery even more remarkable is what came next. Long before modern AI, similar ideas existed in psychology too, in something called the Rescorla-Wagner model, which described how expectations shape what we learn. Schultz's work showed that the brain does this naturally, biologically, without any effort on your part. Dopamine neurons act like a real-time learning signal. They update predictions. They guide future choices. They quietly optimize your actions. This means your brain is always running a kind of learning algorithm, even when you're not aware of it. Even now, as you listen. Now let's bring this back to everyday life. This is why novelty feels so alive. New experiences generate positive prediction errors. They exceed what you expected. And so dopamine responds. But once something becomes familiar, dopamine no longer spikes. Not because the thing became less valuable, but because it became predictable. The brain already knows what's coming. This is why repeated pleasures can lose their glow over time. The reward didn't disappear. The prediction error did. And this is also why unpredictable rewards hold such power over us. When something good arrives inconsistently, sometimes yes, sometimes no, dopamine stays engaged. The brain cannot fully predict the outcome, and so the learning signal stays alive. This is called variable reinforcement. It explains why gambling can become compulsive. Why social media holds attention so tightly. Why notifications are so hard to ignore. The uncertainty itself keeps dopamine interested. The brain keeps whispering, maybe this time. But this same mechanism can also be used gently, wisely. Learning a new skill. Exploring a new place. Challenging yourself in small ways you can't fully predict. When effort leads to occasional, unexpected rewards, dopamine reinforces growth. It strengthens the pathways that helped you succeed. So dopamine is not trying to trap you. It is trying to teach you. It learns from surprise. It adapts from disappointment. It updates its model of the world, moment by moment, without you ever noticing. Understanding this changes things. Motivation is not about forcing yourself to enjoy something again. It's about restoring meaningful prediction errors. Finding ways to surprise the system gently. Letting the brain rediscover that the world still holds things it didn't expect. Let that thought settle now. And when you're ready, we'll continue. Now let's explore something that may help explain a lot about how you feel. To understand why too much pleasure can quietly turn into something heavier, we need to look at one of the most useful ideas in modern neuroscience. It comes from a psychiatrist named Anna Lemke. In her work, she describes the brain as something like a seesaw. On one side, pleasure. On the other side, pain. And the brain's job, its deepest purpose, is not to maximize pleasure. It's to maintain balance. Whenever the seesaw tips strongly toward pleasure, the brain automatically pushes back. It tips the other way, toward discomfort, toward stillness, toward correction. This happens through quiet chemical processes you never feel directly, but you feel the result. When something pleasurable happens, dopamine rises. But shortly after, the brain activates a kind of counterweight. Dopamine signaling softens. Stress chemicals increase slightly. There may be a subtle flatness, a faint unease. This is not punishment. This is homeostasis. The brain is simply correcting for the imbalance, returning to center. Now here's what happens with repetition. When you experience the same pleasure again and again, the pattern shifts. The initial rise, the tilt toward pleasure, becomes weaker, shorter, and the response afterward, the tilt toward discomfort, becomes stronger, longer. The pleasure fades faster. The heaviness lingers more. This is called neuroadaptation. The brain is adapting to repeated stimulation by turning down its response. What once felt exciting becomes ordinary. What once felt ordinary begins to feel dull. And over time, people stop seeking pleasure to feel good. They seek it just to feel less bad. This is the quiet shift from enjoyment to compulsion. Now imagine this ancient balancing system placed inside a modern world. For most of human history, intense pleasure was rare, hard to access, earned through effort or luck. But today, dopamine-triggering experiences are everywhere. Social media, endless video, hyper-processed food designed to overwhelm your taste buds, constant novelty, constant stimulation. The seesaw rarely has time to return to center. It stays tipped. And when pleasure is constant, the counterweight, that low, heavy feeling, becomes the background state, the new normal. This discomfort doesn't always feel dramatic. It often shows up quietly, as anxiety, as irritability, as a strange emptiness, a lack of motivation, a restlessness that doesn't know what it wants. People think something is wrong with them, but very often, it is a balanced brain responding to an unbalanced environment. So what can be done? Lemke emphasizes something important. Willpower alone is usually not enough. Because temptation is strongest when access is easiest. When the thing you're trying to avoid is one tap away, resistance becomes exhausting. This is why she recommends something called self-binding. Self-binding means creating distance between yourself and the stimulus, before the craving even arrives. There are a few gentle ways to do this. The first is physical distance. Change your environment so the behavior becomes harder to reach. Delete an app. Don't keep certain foods in the house. Move the trigger out of sight, out of immediate grasp. The second is time. Add a delay. Wait 24 hours before acting on an urge. Set specific windows for certain activities. Let the craving rise, and watch it fall. without immediately responding. The third is simple rules. Not sometimes, but clear boundaries. Not during weekdays. Not alone. Not after a certain hour. These kinds of rules reduce the need to decide in the moment, when willpower is weakest. These strategies work not because they make you more disciplined. They work because they make impulsive access harder. They give the seesaw time to settle. Lemke also offers a gentle framework for approaching change. She summarizes it with a word you already know: dopamine. Let's walk through it slowly. D is for data. Observe your behavior honestly. What you reach for. How often. How you feel afterward. No judgment. Just noticing. O is for objectives. What do you actually want more of? Energy, calm, presence, focus. Name it quietly for yourself. P is for problems. Which behaviors interfere with those things you want? Not everything, just the ones that pull you away. A is for abstinence. A temporary pause. Not forever, but long enough for the seesaw to rebalance. Long enough for sensitivity to return. M is for mindfulness. When the urge arises, don't fight it. Don't follow it. Just notice it. Feel it in your body. Watch it rise. Watch it fall. It will pass. I is for insight. Explain to yourself what's happening. Name the process instead of blaming yourself. You are not broken. Your brain is doing exactly what brains do. N is for next steps. After the pause, decide what to bring back into your life, and what to leave behind. E is for experiment. Adjust. Test. Learn. No perfection required. Just gentle curiosity. The goal is not deprivation. The goal is restoring sensitivity. When the brain is allowed to rebalance, pleasure becomes subtle again. A walk outside feels like something. A quiet meal feels nourishing. A moment of stillness feels like enough. Motivation returns. Not as a rush, but as a quiet pull toward things that matter. And the seesaw finds its center, not through force, but through understanding how it was built to work. Let that settle now. Now let's look at something that happens quietly, over time. As a behavior repeats, dopamine's role begins to change. In the early stages of learning something new, dopamine is essential. It highlights what matters. It reinforces actions that lead to reward. It whispers to the brain, "This is worth doing again." During this phase, your behavior is what scientists call goal-directed. The brain is actively paying attention, evaluating outcomes. If the reward changes, behavior changes. You're still choosing, but with repetition, something shifts. Control gradually moves away from conscious decision-making and toward automatic execution. The behavior becomes a habit. And at this stage, dopamine spikes become less necessary. The behavior can run on its own now, with very little dopamine involvement, because it has been stored somewhere deeper, in circuits called the basal ganglia. The brain's autopilot. This means something important. A habit can persist even when it stops being rewarding. Even when you consciously want to stop. The loop keeps running. Not because you're choosing it, but because the brain has learned to execute it without asking. This shift, from goal-directed action to automatic habit, has been studied carefully. In one well-known experiment, researchers trained rats to press a lever to receive food. Normally, with enough repetition, animals slowly shift from deliberate action to habitual behavior. The transition takes time. But when the rats received repeated doses of amphetamine, a drug that floods the brain with dopamine, something changed. The transition happened much faster. Habits formed more quickly. Behavior became less flexible. And the rats kept pressing the lever even when the food was reduced or removed entirely. Excess dopamine accelerated habit formation. Not because dopamine created pleasure, but because it locked behaviors into automatic loops. This brings us to addiction. Addiction is often misunderstood as too much pleasure. But that's not quite right. Addiction is better described as a progressive narrowing of what brings pleasure. At first, many things feel rewarding. Food, connection, movement, learning, nature. The world is wide. But over time, as dopamine becomes strongly tied to one behavior or one substance, other sources of reward begin to fade. They still exist, but they no longer register as strongly. The motivational landscape shrinks. The brain becomes biased toward one dominant source of dopamine. Everything else turns gray. This is why addiction is not just about craving one thing. It's about losing interest in everything else. There's another factor worth understanding. It has to do with timing. When the gap between wanting something and getting it is very short, the brain learns to expect instant results. This trains the dopamine system to prioritize speed over effort. And the result is subtle but significant. Patience decreases. Tolerance for waiting fades. It becomes harder to stay engaged with anything that doesn't offer immediate feedback. Long-term goals require sustained effort, delayed rewards, trust in a future that hasn't arrived yet. But a brain trained on instant dopamine struggles with this. It wants the loop to close quickly, and when it doesn't, attention drifts. Motivation weakens. This is why constant, rapid rewards, even small ones, can quietly erode your ability to pursue slower, deeper, more meaningful things. So how does the system recover? Research and clinical experience suggest that a meaningful reset requires time. Approximately 30 days of stepping away from the problematic behavior. Not because the brain is cleaned in that time, but because the seesaw is allowed to rebalance. During this window, dopamine baselines begin to stabilize. Receptor sensitivity starts to recover. And motivation, real motivation, not just craving, begins to re-emerge. For more severe patterns, full recovery can take months, sometimes longer. But the first 30 days are critical. They create the space for change to begin. And there's one more idea worth holding gently. It's called binding. Binding means placing limits around a behavior. Not eliminating it entirely, but restricting it to specific contexts. Only at a certain time of day. Only in a certain place. Never alone. Never on weekdays. These kinds of boundaries might sound simple, but they do something important. They re-engage the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for conscious decision-making. Instead of the habit running automatically, the brain must pause, evaluate, choose. This slows the loop. And when loops slow down, choice returns. Addiction does not mean the brain is broken. It means learning has gone too far in one direction. and learning can always be redirected. There is a pattern worth knowing about. It happens quietly, often without awareness, and it can slowly undermine motivation, even in people who are sincerely trying to improve their lives. This pattern is called dopamine stacking. Dopamine stacking happens when multiple dopamine-releasing things are layered together, all at the same time. Imagine someone preparing to exercise. They take a pre-workout supplement. They drink caffeine. They put on loud, energizing music. They scroll through social media for a few minutes. Bright images, notifications, stimulation, and then they begin. At first, this feels powerful. Energy rises quickly. Focus feels sharp. Motivation seems effortless. But there is a cost. When dopamine spikes are stacked like this, the peak becomes artificially high, much higher than any single activity would produce on its own. And as we've already explored, dopamine peaks always come with a trough. The higher the peak, the deeper the drop afterward. With repeated stacking, the nervous system begins to adapt. Baseline dopamine lowers. Recovery takes longer. And motivation outside of those stacked moments starts to fade. Eventually, people feel like they need all that stimulation just to begin. Just to get started. Just to feel anything at all. This is not because the activity became boring. It's because the brain learned to associate effort with excessive dopamine. And now, normal levels feel like nothing. There's another problem with stacking. A subtler one. If you layer too many dopamine triggers onto something you already enjoy, you can quietly ruin the thing itself. This is important. Let's say you love exercise, or music, or learning, or creating. And every time you do that thing, you also add caffeine, intense music, social media, stimulation piled on top. Over time, your brain stops linking the pleasure to the activity. It links the pleasure to the add-ons. And when the add-ons are removed, when the music is off, when the caffeine is absent, when the phone is away, motivation collapses. The activity feels hollow. Not because it changed, but because dopamine was trained to respond to the wrong things. This is why it matters to protect what you love. Activities that are inherently healthy, inherently meaningful, should not always be amplified. Sometimes, they should be experienced plain. Quiet, unstacked, undramatic. This allows dopamine to stay properly connected to the activity itself, not to the noise around it. Now, let's talk about something many of us carry in our pockets. Nowhere is dopamine stacking more constant than with smartphones. Phones deliver what scientists call variable ratio reinforcement. This is the same reward pattern used in slot machines. You never know when a notification will arrive. You never know what it will contain. You never know whether it will be interesting or empty. Sometimes there's nothing. Sometimes there's something exciting. This unpredictability keeps dopamine engaged. Each glance at the screen becomes a small gamble, a tiny question. Maybe this time. Over time, this trains the brain to seek constant novelty, even in moments meant for rest, even in moments meant for focus, even in moments meant for connection with another person. The phone becomes a portable dopamine dispenser. And because it's always within reach, the brain rarely gets a break from anticipation. This leads to a kind of quiet unraveling. Restlessness. shortened attention, difficulty staying with slower, deeper tasks, a background hum of seeking that never fully settles. Some people try to address this by doing what's called a dopamine detox, but that term is a little misleading. You cannot detox from dopamine. Dopamine is not a toxin. It is a neurotransmitter your brain needs to function. Your brain produces dopamine constantly, even now, as you rest, even while you sleep. What does help is reducing overstimulation. Fewer stacked rewards, fewer artificial peaks, more space between moments of intensity. When stimulation decreases, the nervous system begins to regulate itself. Dopamine sensitivity slowly returns. Baseline stabilizes, and motivation becomes quieter, but more reliable, more yours. The goal is not to remove pleasure from life. The goal is to restore proportion. Pleasure that is spaced out remains meaningful. Pleasure that is stacked and constant slowly loses its power. Now, something shifts. We stop trying to stimulate dopamine, and we begin, instead, to support it. Everything we've explored so far has been about understanding how dopamine moves, how it rises, how it falls, how modern life can quietly pull it out of balance. But now, we turn towards something gentler. Baseline dopamine. This is the quiet, steady level of dopamine that hums through you all day. It's what allows you to feel motivated without needing a push, to feel emotionally steady, to engage with life without constantly reaching for stimulation. The tools we'll talk about now don't create big spikes. They raise and stabilize the floor. Let's begin with cold. Cold exposure, brief and controlled, reliably increases baseline dopamine. Research shows that even a short time in cold water can raise dopamine levels to about 2.5 times their normal baseline. And unlike stimulants, this increase doesn't crash quickly. It can last for several hours. A long, gentle lift. The key is not suffering. It's duration. Water in the range of 32 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. 30 seconds to 2 minutes. That's enough. The dopamine increase doesn't come from shock or pain. It comes from the body learning to adapt to controlled stress. A kind of quiet resilience building inside you. Now a morning light. Sunlight in the first hour after waking plays a surprisingly powerful role in dopamine. 10 to 30 minutes of outdoor light, even on a cloudy day, helps set the rhythms that govern how dopamine is released throughout your day. You don't need to stare at the sun. Just being outside is enough. When this becomes consistent, dopamine rises earlier in the morning, stays more stable through the day, and declines more smoothly at night. This supports both motivation during waking hours and sleep when darkness comes. A simple thing, but it matters. Next, movement. Exercise can raise dopamine to about twice its baseline level. But here's something important. This effect is strongest when the movement is enjoyable. Forced exercise, filled with stress and resistance, doesn't produce the same result. The nervous system reads enjoyment as a signal of safety, of reward, and dopamine responds. One gentle caution here. Try not to always stack heavy stimulation onto exercise. Caffeine, loud music, intense visuals. If these are always paired with movement, the brain begins to link dopamine to the add-ons, not to the exercise itself. To protect movement as a long-term source of motivation, let some sessions be quiet. Unstacked. Just you and the effort. Now, sleep. Sleep is not optional for dopamine health. During deep sleep, dopamine receptors reset. They recover. They recalibrate. When sleep is cut short, night after night, baseline dopamine drops. And the next day, the brain craves more stimulation just to feel normal. This is one of the quietest ways modern life erodes motivation. Not through any single choice, but through accumulated nights of not enough rest. There's also something called non-sleep deep rest. You may have heard it called NSDR. These are protocols, guided relaxation while awake, that help calm the nervous system, reduce stress hormones, and gently restore baseline dopamine. Think of it as maintenance, not stimulation. Just allowing the system to settle. Now, nutrition. Dopamine is built from an amino acid called tyrosine. Tyrosine is converted into something called L-dopa, which then becomes dopamine. Foods rich in tyrosine include eggs, cheese, meat, nuts, and seeds. Eating these doesn't cause a dopamine spike. It simply ensures your brain has the raw materials it needs to maintain healthy levels. A foundation. Nothing dramatic. Let's talk briefly about caffeine. Caffeine affects dopamine indirectly. It increases the density of dopamine receptors, which means dopamine signals become more effective. One source worth noting is yerba mate. Research suggests it may not only support dopamine signaling, but also help protect dopamine neurons over time. This doesn't mean more caffeine is better. Moderation matters. The goal is sensitivity, not stimulation. There are also supplements. L-tyrosine, taken in small amounts, around 500 milligrams, 30 to 60 minutes before focused work, can temporarily support dopamine production during demanding tasks. This can be helpful under stress or when sleep has been limited. But it's wise to watch for a dip afterward. Supplements should support your baseline, not replace rest. Now, meditation. Even brief sessions, 5 to 10 minutes, can help reshape how dopamine works in you. Effortful focus, the kind where you gently bring your attention back again and again, creates a small dip in dopamine. A mild trough. This is useful. Learning to stay present through that subtle discomfort trains the brain to tolerate friction, to remain engaged even without immediate reward. This is especially helpful for procrastination. You are teaching dopamine to activate before the reward arrives, to find meaning in the effort itself. And this brings us to one of the most powerful tools of all. It isn't physical. It's a way of seeing. The idea is this: attach dopamine not to outcomes, but to effort. When effort becomes the reward, motivation stops depending on results. Friction no longer feels like pain. It feels like progress. There's a phrase worth remembering. When friction becomes the reward, you can move from idea to completion while feeling a quiet pleasure the entire way. This is the deepest kind of baseline optimization. Not chasing peaks, not avoiding discomfort, but teaching the brain that effort itself is meaningful. That is how dopamine was designed to work. And that is how motivation becomes stable, quiet, sustainable, something you can carry with you, not just in bursts, but across the long, unfolding shape of your life. Now, let's talk about something many people struggle with quietly: procrastination. It's often misunderstood. People call it laziness, a lack of discipline, a character flaw. But from a dopamine perspective, procrastination looks quite different. It's not that you don't want to do the task. It's that the task feels uncertain, effortful, emotionally heavy. And when discomfort appears, the brain does what it's designed to do. It looks for relief. A faster, easier source of dopamine. So instead of writing the paper, you clean the house. Instead of making the difficult call, you organize files. Instead of starting, you prepare endlessly. These replacement activities feel productive. They give a small sense of accomplishment, a little dopamine reward. But they are not the task. And the real work remains. Waiting. Growing heavier in the background. This creates a quiet loop. Discomfort appears. An easier task takes its place. Dopamine provides short-term relief. And the original task now feels even harder to face. Procrastination is not avoidance of work. It is avoidance of dopamine discomfort. There is a way to interrupt this loop. It sounds counterintuitive at first, but it works. When you feel stuck, when procrastination has settled in, instead of reaching for something easier, you deliberately choose something harder. Not the task itself. Something else. Something brief and uncomfortable. A short burst of cold water. A few minutes of intense movement. A moment of sharp, focused effort on anything at all. This works because dopamine follows contrast. When you introduce a controlled stressor, dopamine dips. The trough deepens for a moment. But when the stressor ends, dopamine rebounds. It rises back toward baseline more quickly. And now, the task you were avoiding feels lighter by comparison. You didn't force yourself to feel motivated. You reset the system. This isn't punishment. It's not about being hard on yourself. It's simply using contrast to restore balance. There's also a longer-term approach worth understanding. It has to do with how you reward yourself. If rewards are constant and predictable, dopamine stops responding to them. They become background noise. But if rewards are occasional and unpredictable, dopamine stays engaged. This doesn't mean rewarding every small effort. It means choosing checkpoints, working for a set period, assessing progress, sometimes offering yourself a reward, sometimes not. The uncertainty keeps the learning signal alive. This mirrors how the brain evolved, staying motivated across long stretches of time when outcomes were never guaranteed. Now we arrive at the final idea. And it's something of a paradox. The modern world teaches us to minimize discomfort, to smooth every edge, to seek ease wherever possible. But neuroscience reveals something different. The most stable, most satisfying dopamine comes not from chasing pleasure. It comes from deliberate discomfort, effort, friction, waiting, patience. When you voluntarily lean into mild difficulty, what some call pain pressing, dopamine release becomes slower, steadier, longer lasting. It doesn't spike and crash. It builds. This is why finishing something hard feels more satisfying than consuming something easy. This is why earned pleasure lingers, while instant pleasure fades. And this is the quiet truth to carry with you. The path to sustained motivation does not avoid discomfort. It uses it. When you stop running from friction, when effort becomes meaningful, when progress matters more than stimulation, dopamine stops controlling you and starts working for you. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, in a way that actually lasts. So as this comes to a close, let yourself settle. You've learned something tonight. Not just facts, but a way of seeing. Your brain is not broken. Your motivation is not gone. It's simply waiting to be understood. And now, you understand it a little more. Let that be enough for tonight. Rest now, and let sleep carry the rest. Good night.